I'll turn it over to Mark.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, he teed me up perfectly for this talk because he ended the last talk talking about virtual fencing, and then I completely failed to include virtual fencing in my flexible fencing talk, which is my fault. It's probably my practical on-farm experience that I didn't include it, but personally, I think it is probably something that is going to continue to show up from a flexible fencing standpoint as something that continues to get a lot of coverage and will probably be a major part of the system in the future. When I was given this talk, I really tried to think about what made flexible fencing and watering systems possible on a rotational system. And inherently what you think is that a flexible system means that I can change where the fences are, right? That's sort of what comes to my mind when I hear the word flexible fencing. But the more I thought about it, I decided a flexible fencing and watering system is whatever works on your farm that allows you to run your groups of animals the way you want to. And so what I want people to take away is that each farm is going to have a very different fencing and watering design. And that doesn't mean that some of them are flexible and some aren't. It just means that they all have to flex a little differently for the types of animals and the types of operations and the types of labor. So we're going to talk a little bit about the watering and the fencing. And then I really want to just touch on both shade and labor as part of fencing and watering systems, because I think a lot of times when we start to do our layouts and make decisions about fencing and watering and making them flexible, the two considerations that get missed are the shade early in that consideration and then the labor requirements for managing it. And then I want to do some just typical layouts, because I think that's really interesting for people to see what other people are doing on their farms. And for me, that's probably one of the most interesting parts about my job, is that I get to go out and see a lot of people doing different things. There are both permanent and temporary fencing and watering systems. And in my mind, the one thing that people will do is the watering system is what makes most fencing and watering systems not flexible, because we have to get water and fencing to get people to graze specific areas of our fields, right? And we have to get them to a watering point in order for that to work. So a lot of times permanent waterers are one of the main hiccups to making our systems flexible. So it is something that we should be considering sort of early in our planning process if we're going to be putting in permanent watering systems, right? And I'm not saying you shouldn't put in permanent watering systems. I have put in 12 in the last 3 years. And it's because I want to have water in a lot of spots on my farm to make rotation work. But that doesn't mean everyone wants to put in 12 waterers. Some people want to think harder and pay less money, right? But there's a lot of different types of permanent water as well. There's both tire tanks, some self-built ones. There's commercial water tanks out on the market. And then I put a picture of a creek here. I mean, in theory, you could move a creek or a pond, but you're not going to. They're permanent watering systems, right? And if we're going to use them as part of our watering system, then we have to put proper access points for the animals to get to those systems without degrading those water sources, right? And that means we have to plan out our flexible fencing and watering systems to give them access at those access points on those systems. The other thing I want you to see here, this is one of my farms, and I just pull this picture up because you can all laugh at how strangely we drew water lines on there, but all of these water lines are marked with a GPS from my phone. And whenever I put in my water lines on any of my farms, and I've put in a lot, I just told you how many I put in, I'm kind of embarrassed of that number, I always walk all of my water lines so that I have institutional knowledge, and if I have a child, I do have a child, if he decides to farm, he's not going to have to figure out where the water lines are when there's a leak like I have to right now by digging up wet spots in the field that could either be a leaking line or a spring, and I don't know which until I dig it up. So I put all of my water lines into my GPS. That's another way to use that technology on farm. It's another value-added thing about having GPS today. The other thing I want you to see on this map that is really important is those water lines aren't straight. Those water lines are run where they're run because of rock and because of ease of running the water line by the person running it that's not getting paid by the foot. They're getting paid by the hour, right? So they're going to run the water line either where I want it or where they want it. It just depends on the day. And sometimes it's intentional, like there's this weird shape to it. But what ends up happening is these water tanks are placed where they need to for wear and tear on the farm. You know, it'd be really nice if I could put, you know, somewhere over here a water tank because maybe it breaks up my fields a little bit better. But the reality is the way the land lays, this is where that last water tank has to go. And I actually have to make my fencing work to make that accessible from multiple fields by laying out my fencing to match the water tank. And this is probably one of the biggest hiccups in the fencing and watering systems, is that the water a lot of times dictates how the fencing lays. This is the reason that a lot of people look at temporary watering systems. It's important to note that temporary watering systems typically use some sort of black pipe, and then they use smaller tanks off of that black pipe. That black pipe doesn't necessarily hold a lot of pressure, so we do still need some form of city water or pressure to bring that water closer on larger farms. So we still need permanent water lines somewhere in this system in order for this to work. And if we are going to do some sort of temporary system, we should probably think about, when we lay out these lines, making sure that we put in some frost-free spigots and some options where we can access that water, that or valves in the system, so that we can make our permanent system tie into a temporary system. The other really important thing I want people to think about with temporary watering systems is, our watering systems ideally are going to let all of our animals drink their necessary amount of water in 4 hours, 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night, because that's typical behavior for cattle, is to drink twice a day. And we want all of those animals to drink in those 2 2-hour periods, because that's what allows the weaker animals to get back out on grass and graze the way they need to. Otherwise, some of those weaker animals won't drink the volume of water that they need. So we really want to make sure we have enough water available for all of those animals to get their drinks in on those temporary watering systems. It is really important that we do that to get the gain on all the animals, or the maintenance energy for all those cows, if that's what we have on our farms. The fencing systems, I think, inherently are a little bit easier for people to see the flexibility in them, especially on the temporary systems. But I'm going to just start with like a sort of my thoughts on temporary and permanent fencing, because permanent fencing is not exclusively eliminated in a flexible fencing system. Some forms of permanent fencing are still going to exist even on a flexible farm, right? Your perimeter fence is probably still going to be permanent. I'm really hoping it is, because temporary fencing on your perimeter makes me very nervous. It's usually more secure. There's lots of options for looks, for visibility, and for some people this is a priority, to have the farm look a certain way. It is more expensive. There is actually labor. So sometimes people will say, well, a permanent fence doesn't have any labor. Well, there's still labor involved in keeping that fence line clean and cleared. It's also extremely difficult to make changes. So inherently, you're not going to move your permanent fences, I hope. If you have to move your permanent fences, you'll be very angry with yourself, most likely. The temporary ones are much more flexible. You can change where those fences are laid out all the time. They're far less expensive to put in. You can always remove them to mow. So from a maintenance around the fence standpoint, it's a little bit easier. But the animals can get through them. A lot of times, we just talked about having those, Cody talked about having those calves creep grazing under a temporary fence. That's not an unusual strategy. And there is labor involved in setting up and taking down those temporary fences, and that should be considered as well. And when we start doing all of our planning work to decide how flexible our fencing has to be, we're really going to be evaluating what size pastures we're looking for. Do we need a variety of sizes, or one size fits all? We're just going to change our days that we're grazing by time of year. Which of those is actually going to be our preference on our farm? And then, are all of our animals together or separate? So some people are going to run cattle and sheep, or they're going to run multiple species, or they're going to run their backgrounded calves and they're going to run their cows. So they have different groups of animals that they're running on a farm, and they're going to have different needs, maybe in terms of size of paddock or groups of animals, and so all of that should come into play in that planning process. There's a lot of different materials out there for that permanent fencing, and the fencing school, I'll talk a little bit more in detail about a lot of these permanent fencing options, because I do think they're really important that you consider all of the different options and choose the right one if this is the type of fencing that you go with on your farm. And realistically, I think you're going to end up with permanent fencing on your perimeter, and I think you're also going to end up with some permanent fencing on your interior fences. I think most farms end up with some interior permanent, and then also they end up with some interior temporary fencing. And this is a flexible system because it allows us to have very large pastures or paddocks that we can then manage in smaller segments in a rotational system, using that temporary fencing within a very large segment of the farm. But it also keeps maybe our hayfield separate, or if we had crop ground, we might have a permanent fence to ensure that our animals don't end up in our crop grounds with our high dollar crops. Temporary fencing wise, lots of materials out there. I put this slide up all the time, and the real thing I want people to know about temporary fencing is that one of the things that makes it really flexible is that it works for all species. It's not like only cattle can be run on a single wire hot fence. I have alpaca at home. I know people have small ruminants at home. Some people are ashamed to say it. It's okay. Some people have horses at home. And any of those animals can actually be run on temporary fencing. But we do have to choose the right type of post to match the animals, because if I run my alpaca on my pigtail fence, it doesn't work very well. But if I run them on a single strand that's at the right height for them when they're grazing, I can still shock them enough to keep them from going under that single wire fence. The other thing I want to say about the temporary fencing, and this is really, I think this is fascinating, is how important the visibility of this temporary fencing is. You know, some of our turbo wires or poly wires, all of these materials with that white coloration or the yellow coloration are much more visible than a single strand of 16 gauge aluminum or steel wire. And it does matter. Animals do respond better because they can see that single wire fence, so there is some real benefits to it. It's also much more portable. It's easier to roll up and unroll versus, say, a wire strand, which is a pain. But there are some lifespan concerns. There are some UV concerns with this. They have very thin strands of wire in them, and over time they do break down. So there is a lifespan on them. As well, it is worth noting that anytime you're using poly wire or turbo wire, the conductivity of that material is going to be less than a single strand of metal. And therefore, you're not going to get quite as hard a shock as you would on your high tensile electrified fences. So easier to move, more flexible in that case. On the negative side, there are some shocking issues. You do really need to maintain this type of fence to make sure that you're going to create the shocks that are going to make the animals stay where you want them. Excuse me. And then the last part of the fencing system, not the last part, but the third major component is the Energizer. This is what creates the shock. This is what creates the electricity that makes the animals stay where you want them to be. There are all different types of Energizers out there on the market, solar-powered ones, AC plugins, ones that run off of just a battery. All of these Energizers will work, but the one thing I want to just note is that a lot of people will say for a flexible fencing system, a solar box or a battery one is going to be more flexible because you can move it around. And I will say this. The grounding system is critically important to getting an electrified fence to do its job. And so every time you move a solar box, you have to have a good grounding system wherever you move it to. So if you're like me and you have a farm that doesn't have electricity and you don't have good permanent fence that you can run electricity inside of, you have to move that solar box, and every time you move that box, you have to put 3 ground rods in the ground, and you curse yourself every time for not having a single point that is going to control your electricity for the whole farm. So there is flexibility in a solar box in the sense that you can move it, but you still need to somehow ground it. And if it's rocky soil or somewhere that doesn't get a good ground anyway, you need to put the ground rods in, and it's just a lot of work. So I will say that I think this is sort of one of those catch-22s, that the solar box gives you flexibility, but at the same time, the solar box creates challenges if you don't get the ground rods properly grounded. To me, the strategy should be find a good point for your Energizer and your grounding rods. and run a hot wire on the inside of any permanent fencing that you have on your major pastures. This is what creates flexibility in your fencing system, because this allows you to run temporary wires wherever you need them. It also does a second thing. It allows animals to not destroy your permanent fences that you just invested a lot of money into. Yes? And do you have a bunch of steel posts in with your, yeah. Well, so I will say this: it doesn't matter where you plug it in on that whole barbed wire system, because the whole thing is a ground system at this point. But yes. Yeah, no, yeah, the whole thing is going to probably transfer the ground. You'll want to be careful. You could actually shock something that just touches the barbed wire when you're trying to ground out something else. But you are correct, it would ground it out pretty well. Steel posts, I mean, long term, they're not the right solution for a permanent, electrified fencing system, because they're painted, they tend to rust, there tends to be some corrosion over time, but you have a lot of metal in the ground on those longer fence lines, and you probably are getting grounding from that. the things you want to consider when you're doing this is, like, you are correct. If you had some sort of electrical storm, you could have some real challenges there. It could get very ugly. I'm glad it's working for you. The spots that I really have issue with it are in spots that I have really rocky soils. Anywhere that's down near a creek, I can usually get away with, one ground rod, and it's fine for me to set up a solar box. But in areas where I have really rocky soil, it's really a challenge to get a good ground. And fortunately, here in Kentucky, we don't have soils that tend to be bad for grounding. We tend to have pretty good soils. We don't have, like, high mineral soils and stuff that tend to really struggle with grounding, which is good. So, but it depends on the farm and the location as to how well they ground out. And the longer the poly wire, the more important that ground is, because the poly wire is only going to carry so much charge, and you have to have enough response to be able to bring that electrical current back around to get a good shock on it. No, you don't need to complete that circuit. The circuit doesn't need to complete that way. The circuit needs to complete only when the animal touches it to the ground. You won't make it shorter. You won't make it see shorter by doing that. And the fencing schools, for anyone else to talk about more permanent high tensile electric and where we do really want to connect them to make it seem shorter, to make the fence see itself as shorter, we'll discuss there. But if you have 5 strands, you want to connect both 5 strands at both ends, and that actually does shorten the length and make the fence look shorter. But connecting one strand in a full loop doesn't really do that. Shade. Shade is one of those interesting things here. It could be anything from trees to buildings to even portable shades. I think the portable shades are absolutely fascinating. I see them a lot more with poultry and small ruminants, but you know, especially here in Kentucky, we have some really hot days in the summertime, and if we're doing a spring calving herd, we might even have some real significant heat during our breeding season. And the last thing we want to do is have our cattle out there and not be providing shade as part of our rotational system. That doesn't make a very flexible fencing and watering system if we can't use all of our land. This is just an example here for you to see. This is a farm. Originally it had two water sources. One was sort of behind the barn and the other one was sort of here in the front. That one in the front is really only there in a corral catch pen. It's a low spot. It's where they catch animals for working. It's a way to catch the animals. If you only give them access to one water source, they all go there eventually. And so it is effective. It also was the only water source for this front pasture. This middle pasture worked off of the one behind the barn. And this back here is primarily a hayfield, but it's a winter or a fall grazing. And there is a single access point for water off of the pond. So they do have water in the back when they get there, but there's not a lot of time that the cattle spend in the back on this farm. And the first thing that the farmer did was they actually broke up this main lot into a winter lot on one side, and they moved the water source up here on top of a hill. And they did that for two reasons. One, it allows the animals to better utilize this whole pasture and this pasture. It also moves the working system up here to this old tobacco barn, and it keeps all these animals out of this really wet, low area, which wasn't ideal anyway for animals to be in the wintertime, drinking their water. And then at the same time that they did that, they also ran city water to 2 points in the front. Anyone want to tell me why we would have to have put two city waters in the front? It's a lot of extra cost over one, isn't it? Size of the field? Somewhat. Anyone know what section we're in the talk? Shade? We're in the shade section of the talk. The only shade in this whole field is right here along this area. It's not really a creek, but it's where water runs, you know, when it rains. I don't know what to call it. A gully. These are the only trees for this whole front field. These people wanted to run their cattle on a weekly rotation, and by the size of the pasture, that meant they needed at least 3 different sections in there. Ideally, it would have been 4, and you would have been able to put one water tank in the center, and you would have been able to rotate around it, right? That would have been the easiest setup from a flexible fencing and watering system, but the shade clearly noted that we weren't going to get trees up in the front in the next 5 or 10 years. So we had to put in 2 water tanks so that we could break that field into 3 sections so that they were only on each section for a week for the animal numbers that they wanted to run. The other thing I just want to touch on briefly, and then we'll do a couple layouts because I think they're fun, is our labor demands on the farm. Temporary fencing and watering systems require very regular labor throughout the summer. For some people, that is a challenge if they work off farm. So for some people, making a flexible system work means they have to have material redundancy. They have to have multiple lines of fencing so they can set them up based upon their work schedules. And that's what actually creates the flexibility on these rotational systems. I only note this because sometimes people say, well, I'm just going to use temporary fencing and it's going to be so much more flexible. Well, it's only flexible if you can set it up when you need to, right? And so for a lot of people that are starting out, that are, you know, looking at a rotational system, but they're still working a second job, there's a material redundancy that needs to occur for that to actually work. They need to have extra fencing lines. They need to have extra step-in posts. They need to have a plan for that. The permanent fencing and watering systems, the reasons that I think people lean towards these sometimes is because of that labor demand that's sort of continuous throughout the summer. But it's not that those permanent systems don't require labor as well. There's significant labor involved in maintaining those as well. It's just that that maintenance can be scheduled if it's done preemptively. So if you plan to go out and weed eat your fence lines, or spray your fence lines or do whatever you're going to do to your fence lines, you can choose to schedule it as long as you stay on top of it, which sometimes makes that part of the system more flexible. And these are just a couple typical layouts. This is one thing I want people to note, is that even if you're going to put in a lot of temporary fencing, a lot of people like temporary fencing and permanent waterers. That's something that people tend to ask for a lot. They don't want to have to handle temporary watering systems all the time, but they want to use a permanent waterer. And if they're going to do that, our goal is usually to set up a centralized watering point and be able to use temporary fencing about it. I strongly encourage people that are thinking about doing this to still set up posts around and a heavy use area around that water tank. That water tank really needs that heavy use area so that those animals don't deteriorate the ground there and they're not standing in mud. That's not what we want. Also, if we set up some permanent fencing and some gates around that water tank, we have a capture point. Anytime that we're going to run a rotational system on flexible fencing, it's very hard to push cattle up to a corral on a single wire hot. Hopefully we can call them with feed if they've been trained to it, but if not, we need some way to capture the animals, and water is always a good spot to capture animals because they always come up to drink, unless you've got a lot of streams and springs. This is a perfect example of a farm. It's a large field, permanent fencing around the edges. There's a water tank here in the center, and it's actually built so that there is some permanent fencing here, 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 and here. And then there's gates on each of those corners, and actually they're using spring gates for the most part. They don't even need to use permanent gates. But if I need to capture an animal out of a field like this, I can just put a couple gates up and capture the animal, and I can push them onto a trailer from there, and I don't have to figure out how to get the animal all the way over here where I need to load out of a group of 20 animals. I can just capture them in the water tank and move on. So having some permanent posts and fencing around that water tank is really important for the flexibility in the system. The other type of system we see somewhat, and this is more often what I get questions about because most people that have a big square field can figure out how to put a water tank in without my help. These people can too. They're all brilliant. Everyone already knows what they're going to do when I show up. They just ask me to confirm that it's reasonable. The rotational systems with a central alleyway we see a lot more often on long, narrow farms or farms where the fields just don't naturally lay out with a true rotation. In this case, this is a feeder operation, and they receive animals over here, and they have a barn over here, and they want to weigh animals pretty often. So actually, it looks like it would naturally rotate around one water tank pretty easily, but they actually still needed a central alley here with permanent fencing, even though they could run some temporary fencing to break up some of their pastures in order to be able to bring those animals up and get weights on them and sort animals as they needed as they were selling the feeders off. It is interesting, though, this one water tank feeds almost all of these pastures. The only ones that feed off of this or the barn are these two right there. The rest of them all feed off of one central water tank. So that's a pretty efficient system. They only really needed to put in one heavy use area and one water tank. And no one walks, I think no one walks over 1,000 feet. It's a little bit over 800 feet, but it's still a pretty reasonable walking distance to get all those animals to one central water tank. This is not a centralized alley. This is a side alley on this design, and I think this is kind of an interesting design as well. This is a farm, cow-calf operation, but this is primarily a crop farmer that's running a few cattle on the side. And what they've done is they've created this alley on the back side of all of their pastured ground here, which is in sort of a greenish color. And it's done in permanent fencing for two reasons. One, it gives them a push alley to get up to their barn, where they work cattle over here. But the other reason it's there is because this is also the route at which they move their combine from one side of the farm to the other. And the last thing they want is for cattle to somehow get through and be in front of them when they're moving their equipment around and opening all those gates. Because when they're moving all that stuff, they're not closing gates at harvest time. They're running all that equipment just on this side of that white fence. And then they can actually come in late fall and graze that one final time just to clean up any grass that's left over there. But this one's actually designed, and you can see the shade reference here. So they've created all of these paddocks here in such a way, pastures, I guess. I think these were cattle, folks. all these pastures here with different trees in them to make sure they have shade in each one of them. These are not what you would want to do necessarily. If you were trying to do permanent fencing, you would instinctively want to do straight lines because it's a lot easier. But with some temporary fencing here, you can very easily cut those trees to give every field access to certain groups of trees, which is really nice and pretty simple to manage. Excuse me. Except for one field here they have as a winter sacrifice field. They do have a winter feeding area in that field for their winter season. And this last one I just want to show you here is, this is a farm that's actually not a commercial farm, it's a seed stock farm. So this person is a producer that's looking to manage their seed stock cattle, and they have much larger pastures here, all with permanent fencing right now. But they're bringing up each group of cattle that they're working, and they have multiple groups out on these different fields up to the barn each day. They have a feeding barn here, and they're bringing in multiple groups to feed each day because they want to see and evaluate these animals each day. On top of which, you know, they're looking for heats and doing some insemination work. And they've chosen to do all permanent fencing on all these fields, and these heavy use cattle alleys that are also done in permanent fencing to bring those cattle in and out. They've chosen to focus their labor on the animals themselves for the genetic portion and not spend their time and energy on the rotational portion. You know, and that's something that each farm is going to have to make that decision about, right? So this for them is much more flexible because they can see all their cattle up at their centralized location each day. And then they can also spend their time and labor on what they want to be focused on and not spend it on moving rotational fences. And to me, it sounded at first, I was thinking, well, is this really a flexible system? Well, it is, in the sense that they've set it up so that they can do something that is not normal, that works for their operation. I consider this a pretty flexible system in the sense that they can bring every cattle group that they have in to feed in one location each day, which is kind of a flexible design. Not what I would be doing on my farm, but that doesn't make it not the right design for their farm. So I just thought this was sort of an interesting question that Chris gave me when he told me I was going to talk about flexible systems, because when I first did it, I thought, oh, well, I'm only going to pick out people that are doing really aggressive rotational systems. That's what's flexible. But maybe it's not. You know, maybe what's flexible is, you know, matching the management to the operations goals, right? So, any questions?